My name is Olivia Grant, and I live in Seattle, Washington. My cedar townhouse sits on Mercer Street, its navy siding catching the afternoon sun, its white trim sharp against the blue-gray sky. From the small balcony, I can see Lake Union shimmer like a sheet of glass. When I bought this house for $1,180,000, it felt like more than a property. It was freedom, my own piece of peace, something built from years of silent effort. Every tile, every wall color, every light fixture carries my choices, my taste, my name, not my ex-husband's. The morning after my divorce, I sat in the kitchen surrounded by stillness. The smell of coffee filled the air, rich and grounding. Yesterday, that same kitchen had echoed with the cruel laughter of Mason Reed, my ex-husband, a man who believed power was proven through money and mockery. He had just signed the final papers at a downtown office. As the pen left the page, he leaned back, smirking like a villain from an expensive movie. "You'll be alone like a worm," he said. "Without my money, you are nothing." Then he stood, straightened his tailored suit, and walked out humming as if he'd scored the final point. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. Because while he thought I'd been living off his wealth, the truth was the opposite. I built mine long before he entered my life. But Mason never saw beyond appearances. My simple sweaters and used Volvo had fooled him completely. He thought I was fragile, dependent, and desperate to stay in his world of private jets and luxury galas. What he didn't know was that the check paying for that jet fuel had my quiet signature on it. Now, as sunlight poured through my kitchen window, my phone started to vibrate across the counter. Unknown numbers, one after another. I ignored them. Then came a sharp knock on the front door, 3 precise raps, followed by silence. When I opened it, 8 people stood on my porch, all dressed in black suits. The woman in front, tall and composed, stepped forward. "Ms. Grant, good morning. I'm Claire Thomas, chair of the board at Reed Aerial Systems. We need to speak with you urgently." Behind her, half hidden near the hedge, was Mason. He looked smaller than usual, his usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. His eyes darted between me and the ground. I gestured for them to come inside. The group moved through my living room, their polished shoes quiet against the oak floor. They glanced at my modest decor, cream sofas, soft gray rugs, a single framed photograph of the Seattle skyline. I could tell they expected chandeliers, not comfort. Claire opened a leather folder and placed it on the coffee table. The gold lettering across the top read Grant Harbor Capital, my private holding company. I recognized it instantly. Mason froze when he saw it. "Miss Grant," Claire began, her tone professional but respectful, "as of this morning, your voting rights in Reed Aerial Systems are fully active. Our records confirm you hold 41% of the company's shares, making you the largest individual investor. The board would like to know your intentions moving forward." Mason laughed under his breath. "Come on, Liv. Tell them you're just a name on paper. You needed my guidance from the start." His attempt to sound calm was almost pitiful. I looked at him, my voice steady. "Reed Aerial Systems was valued at $2.6 billion last quarter, correct?" Claire nodded. "My initial stake was $380 million, I said softly. "I funded it through my own companies, long before Mason and I met." Gasps filled the room. Mason's face turned pale. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He had built his entire identity on being a self-made billionaire. He never imagined that the woman he belittled had been financing the empire he flaunted. I continued. "Last year, when the company struggled with liquidity, I extended a credit line of $120 million to stabilize operations. That line is now callable." Claire leaned forward. "Do you intend to exercise that right?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. Effective immediately. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. One of the men behind Claire shifted nervously, and another whispered something about cash flow. Mason took a step forward, desperate now. "You can't do that. The bank will pull its loans. You'll ruin everything we built." I met his eyes. "You told me I was nothing without your money. I'd like to see how you do, without mine." He looked as if he'd been struck. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by something I hadn't seen in years: fear. Claire closed her folder, nodding slightly. Understood, Miss Grant. We'll proceed with your directives. Our office will coordinate with Grant Harbor Capital within the hour. The group began filing out, murmuring polite goodbyes. Mason stayed frozen near the doorway. When the last person left, I turned back to him. You knew I'd never marry you for wealth, I said quietly. That's why I kept my own away. I wanted to see if you could love me without it. He looked down at his hands, shaking slightly. You lied to me. No, I said. You just never asked the right questions. Outside, the sound of engines started as the black cars pulled away. Mason stayed one last moment in the doorway, his voice breaking as he whispered, You'll regret this. I smiled faintly. I already regret wasting my love on someone who saw only numbers. When the door finally closed behind him, I stood in the silence of my living room. The rain began to fall outside, light and steady, washing the world clean. I poured another cup of coffee and looked out toward Lake Union. The water rippled in silver patterns, calm and endless. For the first time in years, I felt truly awake. Tomorrow, the city would hear about the fall of Reed Aerial Systems. Mason's empire, once praised in business magazines, would crumble under the weight of arrogance and deceit. But I wasn't doing it out of revenge. I was doing it to restore balance, to remind him and myself that money doesn't define worth and silence doesn't mean weakness. As the morning light faded into soft rain, I whispered to myself, he said I'd be alone like a worm. Maybe I will be alone, but I'll be the kind of worm that turns the soil and grows something new. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled, not from victory but from peace. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in a narrow two-story house with cracked siding and a front porch that tilted slightly to the left. My mother, Grace, worked nights cleaning medical offices, and my father, Thomas, fixed elevators during the day. Money was always short, but pride was never lacking. They taught me that if I wanted something to last, I'd have to build it myself. And I did. I still remember the smell of dust and metal when my father came home after long shifts, his hands black with grease. He used to say, numbers don't lie, live. They tell the truth no matter how pretty someone's story sounds. I carried that lesson with me everywhere. When I was 23, I left Cleveland with $1,400 in my bank account and a secondhand laptop that barely started. I rented a small studio apartment in Queens, New York. The walls were thin, and the radiator hissed through the night, but it was mine. That's where my first company was born, an analytics firm that used shipping data to predict supply chain bottlenecks. I coded during the day and met clients in coffee shops at night, offering insights for half what big firms charged. Within 2 years, my software had attracted attention. By the time I turned 27, a logistics conglomerate from New Jersey bought my company for $68 million. I didn't splurge. I didn't even move apartments for another year. Instead, I invested quietly, studying markets while the rest of my friends posted vacation photos in Santorini. A few years later, I built another company, this one a cloud-based shipping platform. I sold it for $210 million. That's when I decided to step out of the spotlight for good. I moved to Seattle, paid cash for my townhouse, and formed a private holding company called Grant Harbor Capital. Through it, I managed my investments under other names, never attaching my face or my story. I was wealthy, but invisible, and I preferred it that way. Then I met Mason Reed. It was at a charity gala in Miami. He was the keynote speaker, tall, handsome, charismatic. His company, Reed Aerial Systems, was gaining attention for its work in drone mapping and aerial data collection. Everyone wanted a piece of him, and he basked in that glow like it was sunlight. I was there as a quiet donor, standing near the back of the room with a glass of water in my hand, listening to him talk about innovation and the future of technology. When he approached me after his speech, his smile was the kind that made people lower their guard. You look like you're thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone here, he said. I smiled politely. That's only because I am. We laughed, and that was how it began. Our relationship moved fast. Within a year, we were married in a small courthouse in Florida. He thought I was just a woman with a modest career in consulting. I let him think that. I didn't want the dynamics of wealth to taint our marriage. I wore simple rings, drove a second-hand car, and insisted on splitting dinner bills. He liked feeling like the provider. It made him feel powerful, secure, and admired. And I, perhaps foolishly, thought love was safer when it wasn't weighed down by dollar signs. When Mason launched Reed Aerial Systems, he faced serious funding challenges. His ideas were bold, but his execution was messy. So, through Grant Harbor Capital, I invested quietly. My lawyers drafted the contracts, deferring my voting rights for 2 years. It gave me control without exposure. He thought I was simply supporting him emotionally, but I was also keeping his company alive. $380 million of my own money propping up his dream. When cash flow tightened again, I extended a private credit line of $120 million at 5% interest to keep operations running. It was my money, my safety net, but he never knew. To him, I was just the supportive wife. I hired a sharp CFO named Noah Brooks and a general counsel named Alicia Ward, two of the best professionals I'd ever met. They worked under the board, not under Mason, and they reported directly to me. Mason assumed they were recommendations from his investors. He never suspected the truth. Sometimes, during dinner, he'd joke about how I was lucky to have him. "You'd still be living in that small house if it weren't for me," he'd laugh. I would smile and take another bite, pretending not to hear the arrogance. Deep down, I was hurt, but I also pitied him. He needed validation more than love. He believed money made the person, while I knew character made the money last. One evening, over wine in our Seattle penthouse, he looked at me and said, "You'd never survive without me, Liv. You need someone to take care of you." I remember the way the city lights flickered through the windows, reflecting in his glass. I said nothing, but that was the night something inside me began to change. He loved being seen. I loved being unseen. He flaunted, I built. He spent, I invested. We were opposites orbiting the same house, pretending we were a team. When the fights began, about my independence, my opinions, my lack of dependence, it was clear he didn't want a partner. He wanted an audience. I started sleeping in the guest room. He started coming home later. The space between us grew wider until all that was left was a hollow marriage filled with noise. And then came the day he looked me in the eyes and said, "You're nothing without me." I carried those words home like shards of broken glass. I laid them out on the kitchen counter the next morning and studied them piece by piece. He didn't know it, but those words freed me. They reminded me of who I had been before the titles, before the luxury, before the arrogance. I had built everything I owned from scratch. I didn't need his validation or his pity. That was when I decided I would stop pretending to be small. Mason thought he held the power, but he didn't realize the entire empire he was standing on was built on my foundation. And if I wanted, I could pull it out from under him with a single phone call. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth. And the truth was I never needed Mason Reed. Mason Reed always needed me. By noon the next day, I was on a flight from Seattle to San Francisco. The clouds below looked like crushed silk, and I spent the entire trip staring through the oval window, rehearsing every word I planned to say. The board had called an emergency session at a law firm on Montgomery Street. The same people who once ignored my existence were now requesting my presence. It was ironic and strangely satisfying. When I arrived, the air in the conference room was thick with unease. Glass walls framed the downtown skyline, and the sun poured through in perfect, blinding streaks. Claire Thomas, the board chair, stood as I entered. Her handshake was firm, professional, but her eyes betrayed relief. To her left sat Noah Brooks, the CFO I had hired in secret, and beside him, Alicia Ward, my attorney and the company's legal counsel. Both nodded in quiet acknowledgement. Through the glass wall, I saw Mason pacing back and forth near the window. His posture told me everything, confident on the outside, terrified underneath. He was surrounded by 2 board members, Rob Patterson and Elena Cruz, both of whom had always been loyal to him when he wore the mask of the Golden CEO. Today, that mask was cracking. When I walked in, Mason turned, his smirk already rehearsed. "Liv," he said, as though we were still married, and this was some domestic misunderstanding instead of a corporate reckoning. "You came. Good. Maybe we can sort this out before you make any rash decisions." I sat down without responding. My chair faced his, and between us lay a long glass table covered in printed reports, ledgers, and my company's letterhead, Grant Harbor Capital. Claire began. "Thank you, everyone. We're here to discuss the callable line of credit issued by Grant Harbor Capital to Reed Aerial Systems, as well as Ms. Grant's voting rights, which have just matured." The room fell quiet. Mason leaned back, arms crossed, pretending to be unfazed. "This is unnecessary. Olivia is upset. She'll calm down once she realizes she's hurting herself too." I met his eyes. "No, Mason. I'm not hurting myself. I'm saving my investment." A faint flush crept across his neck. "Your investment?" "Yes. My investment," I said. "Let's go over the numbers, shall we?" Noah cleared his throat and began reading from the report. Current cash on hand, $17.4 million. Payroll due this Friday, $3.8 million. Outstanding vendor invoices total $22 million. And the $120 million credit line, he looked at me, is callable at your discretion. Mason tried to keep his composure, but I saw the flicker in his jaw. "You wouldn't," he said. "If you call that line, the bank will freeze our credit and every supplier will walk. You'll tank the company out of spite." I leaned forward. "You tanked it with arrogance. I'm here to save it with structure." I turned to Claire. "As of this morning, I am exercising my voting rights. I'm calling the line effective immediately. And I'm proposing new leadership." The shock in the room was palpable. Alicia slid a folder across the table. 3 documents neatly clipped together. "The first motion," she said, "removes Mason Reed as Chief Executive Officer, reassigning him to a non-voting advisory role at $1 per year. The second appoints Olivia Grant as interim chair until the board elects a permanent CEO. The third outlines a restructuring plan, including settlement of outstanding vendor debts and a sale of non-core patents to a Denver firm for $42 million. Mason slammed his palm against the table. "This is insane. You can't just walk in and—" "I can," I said, my tone calm but final. "Because I own 41% of the company, Mason. And unlike you, I understand what the word responsibility means." Rob Patterson spoke up, his voice sharp. "This will destroy confidence. Investors hate instability. The market will punish this." I met his gaze. "The market already has. The last funding round was a down round. Your burn rate is unsustainable. The truth won't kill this company. Your denial will." We voted. Claire called each name slowly. One by one, the hands went up. Claire, Noah, Alicia, Elena, 2 independent directors. 6 in favor. 2 against. Motion passed. Mason stood abruptly, his chair screeching across the floor. His face had turned the color of old wine. "You used me," he spat. "You sat in my house, in my bed, pretending to be grateful while you played puppet master behind my back." I rose too, steady and unflinching. "You told me I was nothing without your money," I said. "Now I'm telling you a fact. You were everything because of mine. You broke your promises, Mason. I won't break the company along with them." For a moment, he looked like he might say something else. But then, realizing he'd lost, he grabbed his coat and stormed out of the room. The glass door swung shut behind him with a hollow thud that echoed longer than it should have. When the room finally exhaled, Claire turned to me and said quietly, "It's done." Noah was already working on his laptop, running numbers for the settlement plan. Alicia was on the phone with a bank in Boston, confirming that the credit line call would be honored. I watched it all unfold, calm but drained. By 3:12 p.m., the wire from Grant Harbor Capital went through, and the funds hit the account. The panic in the market settled before it began. That evening, I checked into a small hotel near Union Square. I ordered tomato soup and a single glass of wine, sitting by the window as the city glowed beneath me. I called my mother back in Cleveland, told her only that I was fine. She didn't ask for details, she never did, but she said softly, "I always knew you'd find your strength again, Liv." After I hung up, I watched the streetlights flicker on below and thought about everything I'd lost and everything I'd reclaimed. For years, I'd hidden behind simplicity, afraid that showing my power would make people love me less. But power doesn't destroy love. It only exposes what was real and what was not. Mason had loved the version of me he could control. The quiet woman who smiled and nodded, who made him feel like the king of a castle he hadn't built. But that version of me was gone now. And for the first time in years, I felt free. As I drifted off to sleep, the city outside pulsed with noise and life. Tomorrow, headlines would tell the story of Mason Reed's fall and the rise of a woman no one saw coming. And I'd be ready to face every one of them, with grace, composure, and the quiet satisfaction of a truth that no longer needed to hide. 2 weeks later, I stood in my Seattle kitchen with the balcony doors open. The rain tapped lightly against the railing, filling the townhouse with a calm rhythm. The air smelled faintly of coffee and rain-soaked cedar. On the counter lay a letter from a private equity firm in New York. Their offer, $480 million for a controlling stake in Reed Aerial Systems. Under the new structure, I would stay on as chair for 1 year before transitioning out. I read the letter twice. It wasn't just an offer, it was closure. My net after taxes and fees would be roughly $310 million. I already had more than I could ever need, but this deal wasn't about the money. It was about ending the story on my terms. I signed the papers at noon, sealing away years of betrayal, silence, and lessons learned. At 5 in the evening, there was a knock on the door. I didn't expect anyone, and yet when I opened it, there he was, Mason. He stood in the drizzle wearing a black wool coat, his eyes hollow but softer than I remembered. For a moment, we both stood frozen, like strangers with too much history between them. He glanced around my living room, his eyes landing on the simple lamp beside the sofa, the small stack of books on the coffee table, and the cheap vase filled with daisies from the grocery store. "You really live like this?" he asked quietly, not in mockery but disbelief. "This is how I've always lived," I said. "You just never notice." He stepped inside but didn't sit. His voice was quieter than before, stripped of arrogance. "I came to say I'm sorry. For everything. I was cruel. I thought if I made you feel small, I could feel big again." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." He hesitated, shifting his weight. "We could try again, Liv. I understand now. I understand you." I met his eyes, calm and unshaken. "No, Mason. You understand what you lost. That's not the same thing." He lowered his gaze to the floor, his voice barely above a whisper. "What will you do with the company?" "Build it," I said. "Or sell it. Either way, it will be honest this time. People will get paid on time. The numbers will be clean. No inflated projections. No empty promises." He looked out toward the lake, his reflection faint in the rain-specked glass. "You were the best thing I ever had," he said. He meant it, but it didn't matter anymore. After he left, the house felt still again. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, though only one would be used. An hour later, my friend Julia arrived from Portland, holding a lemon pie she'd baked herself. She'd always been the kind of friend who showed up when words weren't enough. We sat on the balcony, the pie untouched between us, watching the city lights blink on across Lake Union. I told her everything, how Mason had laughed the day of the divorce, how he had stood behind the shareholders like a coward, and how the look on his face changed when he realized I was the true investor all along. Julia laughed so hard, she wiped tears from her cheeks. When I read her the offer letter from New York, she grew quiet. "You did it," she said finally. "You really did it." "I didn't destroy him," I said softly. "I just let the truth do its job." That night, when she left, I made one last call. It was to a small public school in Cleveland, the same one where my mother used to clean classrooms after hours. I told the administrator I wanted to start a scholarship for girls who wanted to study business, coding, or finance. 10 students to start, $12,000 a year each. enough to open doors that had once been locked for me. I named it the Grace Grant Foundation, after my mother, who believed in work before luck. As I wrote the details on a yellow sticky note, I smiled. It was the first time I'd felt my past and future in the same room without tension between them. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The sky was still gray, the kind of Seattle morning that hums quietly before the city wakes. I rolled up the living room rug and spread out a stack of maps across the floor. Seattle, New York, Boston, maybe even London for a year. I could already picture myself walking through Hyde Park in autumn, coffee in hand, anonymous again. But America would always be home. I thought about buying a new place, maybe a small white stucco house in Santa Barbara with blue shutters and a lemon tree in the yard, something around $2.4 million. A place where the air smells like salt and sunlight, not rain and regret. For once, I wasn't making plans out of fear or strategy. I was dreaming, and I'd earned the right to. Later that day, I drove to my lawyer's office downtown to finalize the transfer documents. On the elevator ride up, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. I didn't see the quiet, nervous woman who had once shrunk herself to fit into someone else's ego. I saw someone steady, grounded, and finally free. As I signed the final page, Alicia, my attorney, said, "You know, Mason's been calling our office nonstop. He wants to talk about a settlement or maybe a partnership." I smiled faintly. He'll get used to silence. When I got home, the sun had broken through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, the air smelled clean, like something was beginning instead of ending. I stood on the balcony and watched a seaplane take off over the water, its reflection gliding across the lake's surface before vanishing into the sky. In that moment, I realized I wasn't defined by loss or revenge or even success. I was defined by persistence, by every time I rebuilt myself quietly while the world thought I'd fallen. I walked back inside and locked the balcony door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was soft, final, and perfect. I wasn't a worm. I wasn't alone. I was a woman with her own name, her own key, and a future fully paid for in truth.